Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome to episode 140. As we were working on our legislative session here in Utah, we were working on an issue that is actually really exciting, really impactful in a lot of people's lives, and that is the issue of expungement, which probably most of you have never heard of or let alone understand what that means. We're going to unpack that today and how this process, in particular, a new approach to it, is helping a lot of people's lives. I am joined today by Rebecca Vallas, who is Vice President of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress, to talk about it. Rebecca, thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's maybe start at a high level. A lot of our listeners probably aren't familiar with expungement, so let's use me as an example. Let's say I'm caught with, marijuana coming back from Colorado. I'm pulled over on the side of the road. I now have a criminal charge, and I have to go through that process. At what point does expungement come in, and how does that work for me in my situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I feel like before you even get into talking about expungement, you almost have to talk about why it matters and why it's a policy solution that has the level of bipartisan support that it does. So a really important starting point here is to understand that following decades of over-criminalization in the United States, we now have about 1 in 3 Americans having some type of criminal record. Now, having a felony conviction is maybe the greatest stigma that someone can face, but even a minor criminal record, like one that would stem from the scenario you're describing, can basically be a life sentence to poverty. And that's because about 9 in 10 employers, 4 in 5 landlords, 3 in 5 colleges all use background checks to screen applicants' criminal records. So even though something can be just a single mistake that someone makes on maybe the worst day of their life, it can stick with them like a scarlet A that never goes away. That's where expungement comes in. Most states allow people to petition for expungement or sealing of certain types of criminal records, recognizing that a criminal record shouldn't follow someone necessarily for the rest of their life. And getting that criminal record cleared can be absolutely life-changing. It can allow people to really move on with their lives and have access to jobs and employment and housing and education and all the other types of basics that people need so that they can support themselves and also support their families. That's what expungement is really about, is about allowing people to move on with their lives.
And so in my scenario that I describe, I am charged, let's say, with, Class B misdemeanor. I'm not going to go to jail for it, but let's say I get a, $200 fine. I pay that fine. Maybe I plead down to something else. I have a plea in abeyance as long as I do not, reoffend or commit another offense in the next year or whatever the case may be. Maybe it falls off my record. I no longer have that. But to your point, the fact that I was initially arrested or the actual criminal charge itself stays with us. How does this play into people's perception that, well, if you do the crime, you got to do the time, and this is just a consequence of you committing that offense, is to have that on your record so that future employers and landlords and others know about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I mentioned that there's employers and landlords and colleges and others who are all using background checks, and that's a big part of why these records can stick with us in the digital era. But it's not actually even just those third parties. It's also been this huge creep of laws and restrictions that are on the state level as well as the federal level that limit access to jobs, occupational licenses, credit, housing, education. People with records today potentially face some 50,000 such restrictions. And as a result, they can end up facing every single door closed in ways that can mean that they and their families really don't ever get that second chance that this country claims that we care about. One specific example, a criminal record reduces a job seeker's chance of getting a callback or a job offer by nearly 50%. And people who have actually experienced incarceration, which is not the scenario you're describing, but formerly incarcerated people are nearly 10 times more likely than the general public to experience experience homelessness. But you're making a really important point, which is that a person doesn't need to have ever even spent a day behind bars. They don't even need to have been convicted of a crime for that record, even an arrest record or charges that were dropped, to stick with you, just like all these other types of records that we're talking about. So that, again, is where expungement comes in. And states have tremendous variation in terms of what they allow to be expunged, what the process looks like. But one thing that most of these state processes have in common is that they require people to file petitions and actually find a lawyer, go in front of a judge, and navigate what can be an incredibly complicated and even Byzantine process in order to get their record cleared. And that petition-based system that most states have on the books means only a tiny fraction of people who are eligible for expungement ever get the relief that they need. This is something that experts have started to call the second chance gap. And it basically sets up a two-tiered system of justice where if you have lots of resources at your disposal and you're able to hire a fancy lawyer, maybe you're able to navigate that process and get your record expunged. But if you're not able to hire that fancy lawyer, you're probably not going to be able to make it through that process and end up on the other side with your record getting expunged. And a study actually just came out last week from the University of Michigan that puts some numbers to this experience. It tells us that people eligible for expungements in Michigan, only 6.5% of them ever actually get their record expunged within 5 years of becoming eligible. Let those numbers sink in. That's why this petition-based system actually has some real problems with it. And that's why we're now watching bipartisan lawmakers in states across this country start to realize that maybe what we should be doing is automating this process so that everyone who's eligible can get relief fairly.
So to your point, it's almost like a second sentence where you were sentenced, whether it's to jail or prison time or simply a fine, community service, whatever the sentence actually requires of you, and you fulfill that. You've, quote unquote, paid your debt to society. You've served the terms that were stipulated at the time of sentencing, but then you have this broader consequence that complicates your life that you don't realize at the time of sentencing. Perhaps the judge, never intends. No one really wants to complicate and burden your life once you've, quote unquote, paid your debt to society. And yet that impact remains, that consequence is there. And to your point, most of these people, when they're low income, they can't afford an attorney. They don't know how to go through the process. They don't even know they're eligible to expunge the crime. That sits on their record, continuing to negatively affect their life for years to come. Is that a fair way to put it?
That's a very fair way to put it. And when you consider that the vast majority, I believe it's 8 out of 10, even 9 out of 10 criminal defendants are actually income eligible for a public defender because they're too poor to afford a private lawyer, that tells you everything you need to know about how little in resources most people who come into contact with the justice system are, and how little in resources they are going to have to hire a lawyer on the back end when they're serving out yet another sentence, this time to poverty.
So I want to touch on the automation of this very exciting new development. Before we get to that, let's imagine that one of our listeners has a question. They're an employer and they think, well, wait a minute. I don't know that I like this idea because if someone has committed an offense in the past, maybe it's a robbery and I don't want to hire someone who is dishonest, or maybe it's someone who had they were abusive, and I don't want to put them in an environment where they're working with teenagers or children or things like that. So from the perspective of an employer who does do background checks, or even a landlord, and they have an interest in knowing if this person has had any past altercations, run-ins with the law, maybe address for that type of concern why expungement is still a good answer, and effectively denying that employer or landlord the ability at a certain point in the future to access that information. Is that a good thing for the employer, landlord? Is it a right public policy to deny them that information about a person's past? How do you respond to that concern?
One of the things that I always think about whenever I hear these kinds of questions is how out of step our current legal landscape and also so much of the social stigma that's out there associated with having a criminal record, how out of step it is with the reality of what we know about people who do come into contact with the justice system and their likelihood of reoffending in the future. So one statistic that really sums this up nicely is that people with criminal records who have remained crime-free for just 4 to 7 years are no more likely than the general population to commit a new crime. So if people who have this scarlet A on their chest for the rest of their lives are being treated as criminals with a capital C or ex-convicts or all of the horrible stigmatizing, dehumanizing language that the mainstream media often slaps onto people just because they've come into contact with the justice system, these are people who are after a few years of proving that they've paid their debt to society and they haven't reoffended, they're no different than anybody else. And when we're reaching a point where now 1/3 of the adult U.S. population has some type of criminal record, to just throw that entire segment of this country out and say these are people who never get jobs or never get housing, that's just a recipe for incredibly high rates of recidivism and shutting people out of being able to get back on their feet and successfully reintegrate into their communities. So for anyone who cares about criminal justice reform and reducing mass incarceration, which I know your listeners do, we need to be taking steps on the back end so that people have the tools, yes, but also don't have all of the insurmountable obstacles in their way to successful reentry, so that we can be ensuring that our communities are safe and that people have a chance to access that second chance that they deserve.
And so, as you point out, very few who are eligible for the benefits of expungement to remove that kind of cloud following them as they're trying to find a job, they're trying to find an apartment and rebuild and get on with their life and become a productive member of society. Very few of them are taking advantage of that. They're effectively resigned to continued sentencing and consequences of something that they already paid their fine, did their time, whatever the case may be. So as you point out, there's this new opportunity, this new development in the expungement arena. 2 states have now moved forward, Pennsylvania and our state, Utah. So we worked on this in the past few months. Talk to us about what each state is going to have a different law, slightly different process. But broadly speaking, as it's become known as this clean slate initiative or campaign that you guys are a part of, help our listeners understand, kind of broadly speaking, how this automation process would work and why it's such a positive development.
So we talked a little bit about how just a small fraction of people who are eligible for expungement ever get the relief that they need or are ever able to get their records cleared, that second chance gap that we were just talking about. And so that is exactly where this groundbreaking new policy that we have seen become law in Pennsylvania last year, and now Utah just in the past week has become the second state in the country to adopt a similar policy. That's exactly where this clean slate idea comes in. It's about automating the record clearing or expungement process once someone remains crime-free for a set period of time. So if they've paid their debt to society, if they've shown that, just like we were talking about before, they're now no more likely than others to commit a new crime, it's about allowing them to automatically have their record cleared once they satisfy those conditions, so that they don't need to go find a lawyer and bog up the court dockets and go in front of a judge. It's actually an incredibly burdensome set of work that these courts have to do, and these are courts that are overtaxed and under-resourced as it is. So that's where this clean slate idea comes in. It uses technology to streamline the existing expungement process so that more people with records can get the second chances that they've earned, and it does that by effectively setting up a computer query to screen who has met these criteria so that courts can push a button and automatically do something that otherwise is not just unfair in the burden it puts on individuals to navigate a complicated system, but also will then be a streamlining of a burdensome court process that right now is straining courts in states everywhere across this country. It's something that really is incredibly common sense when you think about it, for all the reasons you and I have been talking about, and that's why we're seeing people who agree on almost nothing else. I know I can say that that about my organization. The Center for American Progress doesn't usually appear on necessarily conservative podcasts, right? But here we are, you and me, agreeing about something like this. It's the reason that we've come together with unlikely bedfellows like Koch Industries and Freedom Works and other groups where we really can't talk about much else at all that we might see eye to eye on. That's why everyone really agrees. This is about helping people get back to work. It's about helping enable people to access the tools they need to provide for their families. It's about helping states save taxpayer dollars because of the reduced incarceration that will result when fewer people recidivate and have more people have successful reentry. It's also a no-brainer when it comes to our national economy. Every single year, our national economy is actually losing $87 billion in lost gross domestic product. That's because of shutting people with records out of the labor market, and state economies suffer as a result. So it's really the classic definition of a win-win, and that's why we're seeing people on right, left, and all across the political spectrum line up behind these clean slate policies in state after state after state.
Very exciting, and it was very interesting as we worked on the policy here in Utah. We had several meetings with the courts and prosecutors and other stakeholders trying to work out the particulars of what the language would be and the fiscal impact of creating the systems to automate the process and doing all the logistical work on it. It was really interesting where initially when we came out, when the Representative Hutchings was working on the proposal and we had the initial draft that the courts were considering, it was very interesting to see the cost that they were estimating, the staggering, few $1 million that they were thinking that this would require to set up these systems and do all this work. And then you realize when you break down the numbers, how much caseload not only going forward, but the backlog of people who have been eligible for expungement for years but have never done it. And so talking to the courts about how much work this is going to be, you got to figure out, okay, how do we allocate taxpayer dollars for this and how do we get the political will to do this? But when you really realize what you're talking about, that there's all these, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are eligible for expungement but currently haven't gotten their record expunged simply because they haven't jumped through the hoops, paid the government the money to be able to do it, you realize that this policy, automating this and just kind of clearing things out once they've become eligible for expungement and they haven't reoffended and all these other qualifications, you realize how many people this is actually going to impact in a positive way. It's a very humbling thing to consider the real world impact this is going to have on people's lives who we will never see, right? Like you and I work in this policy arena at this high level and we're tinkering with the laws and the process and the logistics, but the boots on the ground, real human impact of this is very significant.
No, it really is, and it's certainly why my heart is in this work. I actually used to be a legal aid lawyer who represented people who had criminal records that were holding them back from finding jobs and housing and education and more. So it's those clients and my memories of those individuals who were unjustly deprived of a second chance that they had truly earned. That's why I am doing this work, and that's why the Center for American Progress's poverty team. You might be wondering, why is it that here I am as I represent the poverty program? It's, I don't have criminal justice in my title. Why are we doing this work? That's really a big part of why. And I'll share that there's one particular individual from the Pennsylvania work whose face I see in my mind almost every single day when I talk about these issues. His name is Ronald Lewis, and he's for a long time been one of the lead spokespeople for why clean slate is common sense, not just in Pennsylvania or in Utah, really, but in any state in this country. And he shares his experience of what it's going to mean for him to benefit from the clean slate law that's now taking effect in that state. The way he puts it is that this is like a cold drink of water on a hot summer day. It's about a new lease on life, and it's about feeling that he actually now has that second chance that the court system told him he was going to have to earn. It's absolutely life-changing when people are able to become unburdened from the scarlet A that has been holding them back in so many ways. And one thing that we haven't talked much about yet, you and me, in this conversation today, but that your listeners may appreciate, is how much of this is really a family policy. And this is not just about individuals with records. It's also about their kids and about their families. when you actually think about the scale of 1 in 3 American adults having some type of criminal record, people rarely think about the family members whose lives are touched. Nearly half of American kids now have at least one parent with a criminal record. And the barriers that are associated with that parent's record can have incredibly long-lasting and negative consequences for children's school performance, for their cognitive development, even their employment outcomes in adulthood. So if we want to be not just giving people second chances that they've earned, but also making sure that we're not creating a permanent underclass of the next generation of these people's children, Clean Slate is a policy that we need to see states take up in droves.
This is great. To that end, we will link on our show notes page today to the Clean Slate campaign. So any listeners who are curious about this, want to learn more, want to talk to a lawmaker or a think tank or whatever in your state and get them working on this. There are now 2 states, Pennsylvania and Utah, to learn about, to follow. There's model policies to look at. We will link to that on societyandthestate.com/140. Rebecca Vallas is Vice President with the Center for American Progress. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for all of your work bringing Clean Slate to Utah.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.